I was standing in my kitchen at 7 in the morning, coffee in hand, when I saw Patricia Mullins Power walking down the sidewalk toward my house with a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. The woman moved with the determination of someone who'd found a new violation to obsess over, and I had a sinking feeling I was about to be her target. Living in Meadowbrook Heights, HOA in suburban Columbus, Ohio had been relatively peaceful for the past 3 years, but Patricia had taken over as president 6 months ago, and everything had gone downhill fast. She didn't even make it to my front door. Instead, she stood at the edge of my driveway, staring up at my gutters with her phone raised, taking pictures. I set down my coffee and headed outside, the January cold biting through my sweater, the moment I stepped onto the porch. "Morning, Patricia," I called out, keeping my tone neutral. "Something I can help you with." She spun around, her perfectly highlighted blonde bob not moving an inch despite the wind. "Graham Jackson, I'm documenting a safety violation on your property. Those icicles hanging from your gutters are at least 2 feet long and pose a serious hazard to anyone walking past your home." I glanced up at the icicles. They were impressive, I'd give her that. The past week had been a cycle of thawing during the day and freezing at night, creating some genuinely substantial ice formations along the edge of my roof. But hazardous? That was a stretch. They're icicles, Patricia. They happen in winter. "They're dangerous," she countered, her voice rising. "What if someone walks by and one falls on them? What if a child gets hurt? The HOA has a responsibility to maintain safety standards throughout the community." I crossed my arms, the cold really starting to seep in now. "And I have a responsibility to deal with my property as I see fit, within reason. Those icicles will melt in a few days when the weather warms up. Unacceptable." She tapped something on her clipboard with aggressive finality. "I'm issuing you a formal notice to remove them within 48 hours, or you'll face a $500 fine." $500. The number was absurd enough to make me laugh. For icicles. For creating a hazardous condition on your property that affects the safety and welfare of the community. She was reading from something on her clipboard now, her tone taking on that official quality that people use when they want to sound more important than they are. Per the updated HOA bylaws, Section 12, Subsection 4, any condition that poses a potential liability risk must be remediated immediately at the homeowner's expense. Updated bylaws. When were those updated? The board voted on them last month. The minutes were posted to the community website. She gave me a tight smile. "Ignorance of the rules doesn't excuse you from following them, Graham." I took a deep breath, reminding myself that losing my temper with Patricia would only make things worse. "I'll look into it." 48 hours, she repeated, then turned on her heel and marched back toward the sidewalk, her sneakers squeaking against the cold pavement. I stood there for a moment, watching her disappear around the corner before heading back inside. My coffee had gone cold, which felt appropriate for the morning I was having. I grabbed my laptop and pulled up the Meadowbrook Heights HOA website, navigating to the Documents section. Sure enough, there was a PDF labeled Updated Bylaws January 2025. I downloaded it and started reading. What I found made my blood pressure rise with each page. Patricia and her board hadn't just made minor updates. They'd essentially rewritten the entire rulebook, expanding their authority to fine homeowners for an increasingly ridiculous list of violations. Grass over 3 inches tall. $100 fine. Holiday decorations up past January 5th. $250. Visible garbage cans more than 12 hours before or after pickup. $150. And there it was, buried in Section 12. Any condition deemed hazardous by the HOA board could result in fines up to $1,000, with escalating penalties for non-compliance. I sat back in my chair, processing what I was reading. This wasn't normal HOA oversight. This was a power grab disguised as community management. And Patricia was wielding that power like a weapon. Here's the thing Patricia didn't know about me. I'm an insurance adjuster, and not just any adjuster. I specialize in commercial liability policies. And for the past 5 years, one of my biggest clients has been Midwest Community Management, the company that provides liability coverage for homeowner associations throughout Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana, including Meadowbrook Heights. I picked up my phone and called my office, reaching my colleague Derek before the morning meeting started. "Graham, what's up?" Derek answered, sounding distracted. "You're not calling in sick, are you? We've got the Morrison renewal this afternoon." "I'll be there for Morrison." "Listen, I need you to pull a file for me. Meadowbrook Heights HOA here in Columbus. I want to see their current policy and any claims history." "Your own HOA? What's going on?" "They're trying to fine me $500 for having icicles on my house." Derek laughed. "You're joking." "I wish I was. Can you pull it?" "Yeah, give me 10 minutes. I'll email it over." I spent those 10 minutes reading through more of the updated bylaws, getting angrier with each ridiculous rule. When Derek's email came through, I opened the attached documents and started reading. Meadowbrook Heights carried a $2 million general liability policy through our company, with standard exclusions for intentional acts, criminal activity, and negligence. Their premium was about $18,000 a year, which was reasonable for a community of 120 homes. But what caught my attention was the claims history. In the 6 months since Patricia had taken over, there had been 3 claims filed against the HOA. One was from a homeowner who'd been fined repeatedly for having the wrong shade of brown mulch in their flower beds. The claim alleged harassment. Another was from a couple who'd been threatened with legal action for installing solar panels without HOA approval, even though Ohio state law explicitly allows solar installations. The third was from a contractor who'd been banned from the community after complaining about Patricia's behavior when he was doing work for a homeowner. None of the claims had been paid out yet. They were all still under review. But they painted a clear picture of an HOA board that was operating outside the bounds of reasonable authority. I made myself another coffee and thought about my options. I could just knock down the icicles and move on with my life. It would take maybe 15 minutes with a broom. But doing that would set a precedent that Patricia could bully homeowners into compliance with unreasonable demands. And if I knew anything about liability insurance, it was that boards who operated this way eventually got their communities into serious legal trouble. My phone rang. It was my boss, Linda Harper. "Graham, Derek mentioned you were looking into your HOA's policy. What's going on?" I explained the situation, including the updated bylaws and the claims history. Linda listened without interrupting, which was never a good sign. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How many homes in your community?" she finally asked. 120. "And they're trying to fine you $500 for ice formations that occur naturally in winter weather. That's correct." "Graham, I need you to be very careful here. You have a professional obligation to maintain objectivity with our clients, even when you disagree with their decisions. I understand that, but I also have an obligation to advise them when they're creating liability exposure for themselves. These bylaws they've passed are going to generate lawsuits. Some of these rules might not even be legally enforceable." Linda sighed. "You're not wrong, but Patricia Mullins has been very clear that she doesn't want to hear from adjusters about how to run her community. She called me last month complaining that we were overstepping by suggesting they consult an attorney before implementing new fine structures. She called you. Oh yes, very indignant about it too. Told me that the HOA board knows what's best for their community and doesn't need insurance people telling them how to do their jobs. Linda paused. Between you and me, I've been considering whether we want to continue covering them when their policy comes up for renewal in March. They're becoming a high-risk client. That was interesting. What would happen if you didn't renew them? They'd have to find coverage elsewhere, which would be difficult given their claims history. Most carriers would either deny them or charge double what we're charging. Without liability coverage, they can't legally operate as an HOA in Ohio. They'd have to dissolve the board. An idea was forming in my mind. Linda, what if I documented this situation as a potential liability issue? The Icicles, I mean. Not to protect myself, but to show how their current decision-making process is creating exposure. How would Icicles create liability exposure for them? Because they're claiming the Icicles on my property are a hazard, which implies they believe someone could be injured by them. But if they're such a hazard, why are they waiting 48 hours to require removal? Why not demand immediate action? And more importantly, why are they putting the liability on me as the homeowner when they're the ones defining it as a community safety issue? I was thinking through it as I spoke. If someone actually did get hurt by an icicle in the next 2 days, the HOA would share liability for knowing about the hazard and failing to require immediate remediation. They're creating a paper trail of negligence. Linda was quiet again, but I could practically hear her mind working. That's actually a solid point. Send me a formal memo documenting the situation. Include photos of the Icicles, a copy of the fine notice, and your analysis of the liability exposure they're creating. I'll add it to their file. Will do. And Graham, don't knock down those Icicles yet. Let's see how this plays out. I spent the next hour putting together the memo, taking detailed photos of my gutters from multiple angles and documenting the weather conditions. The Icicles were large, sure, but they were at least 6 feet above the sidewalk and would require someone to be standing directly underneath them to be at risk. A reasonable person would simply walk around them. I noted that in my analysis. By the time I finished, it was almost 9:30. I needed to get to the office for the Morrison meeting, but before I left, I decided to do something that would probably annoy Patricia, but would also protect me legally. I put up a small orange cone on the sidewalk beneath the worst of the Icicles, the kind used for wet floor warnings. Then I added a handwritten sign, "Caution, ice above." It was petty, but it also documented that I'd taken reasonable steps to warn people about the supposed hazard while waiting for it to naturally resolve itself. The day at work was busy enough to keep my mind off the HOA situation, though I found myself periodically checking my email to see if Patricia had sent a follow-up. She hadn't. The Morrison renewal went smoothly, and I grabbed lunch with Derek, who was still amused by the whole Icicle situation. "You should just pay the fine and move on," he said, biting into his sandwich. $500 isn't worth the stress." "It's the principle," I replied. "Today it's Icicles. Tomorrow it's something else. Patricia's on a power trip and someone needs to push back." Someone, but does it have to be you? I thought about that. Honestly, yeah, I think it does. I'm in a unique position here. I understand insurance liability. I know what they're covered for and what they're not. Most of the other homeowners don't have that knowledge. They're just getting bullied into compliance. Derek shook his head. "Your funeral, man. HOA boards can make your life miserable." He wasn't wrong about that. I'd seen it happen to people before. But I also knew that HOA boards operating outside legal boundaries could be reined in, especially when their insurance company started asking questions. That evening, I got home to find a formal notice taped to my front door. It was a printed letter on Meadowbrook Heights HOA letterhead, signed by Patricia and dated that morning. The letter reiterated the 48-hour deadline to remove the icicles and added a new wrinkle. If I failed to comply, the HOA would hire a contractor to remove them and charge me for the service, plus an additional $200 administrative fee. I photographed the letter and emailed it to Linda with a brief note explaining this latest development. Then I went inside and poured myself a beer. Through my front window, I could see the icicles glinting in the late afternoon sun. They really were impressive. It seemed almost a shame to take them down. My phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor, Robert Chen. He lived 3 houses down and had always been friendly, though we weren't close friends. The message said, "Hey man, Patricia came by asking if I thought your icicles were dangerous. Told her they are just ice. Heads up, she's going door to door." I texted back, "Thanks for the warning. She's really committed to this." Robert replied, "She stopped by yesterday about my basketball hoop, said it's too close to the street and kids playing might run into traffic. Gave me a warning notice. Woman has too much time on her hands." This was worse than I thought. Patricia wasn't just targeting me. She was working her way through the neighborhood, finding violations wherever she could. I wondered how many other homeowners had received notices in the past few months. The next morning, I woke up to find that the temperature had dropped overnight and the icicles had actually grown larger. I took fresh photos, noting the date and time, and added them to my documentation file. Then I did something that would definitely annoy Patricia. I posted the photos to the Meadowbrook Heights community Facebook group with a caption that read, "Mother Nature's artwork. Anyone else have impressive icicles this week?" The response was immediate. Within an hour, a dozen other homeowners had posted photos of their own icicles, many of them larger than mine. Several people commented that they'd received violation notices from the HOA about various issues in recent weeks. A woman named Susan complained that she'd been fined $150 for having her garage door open for more than 3 hours while she was reorganizing it. Another person, Todd, said he'd gotten a warning for parking his truck on the street overnight, even though there was no parking restriction in the community bylaws. Then Patricia joined the thread. "These icicles represent a serious safety concern," she wrote. "The board is working to protect all residents from potential liability. We appreciate everyone's cooperation in maintaining a safe community." Someone responded, "Patricia, icicles happen every winter. Are you going to fine everyone who has them?" Patricia's reply came fast. "Only those whose icicles pose a clear hazard. The board evaluates each situation individually." I couldn't help myself. I commented, "Patricia, what criteria does the board use to determine if an icicle is hazardous? Is there a specific size threshold? And who on the board is qualified to make that assessment?" The thread went quiet for several minutes. Then Patricia responded, and I could feel the annoyance through the screen. "The board uses reasonable judgment based on community safety standards. We don't need to justify our decisions to individual homeowners." A guy named Marcus jumped in. "Actually, you kind of do. That's how HOA boards work. You're accountable to the homeowners." The thread devolved from there with people taking sides. Some supported Patricia, arguing that the board was just trying to keep everyone safe. Others thought the whole thing was ridiculous. I stopped engaging and just watched, documenting the conversation with screenshots. At work, Linda called me into her office. She had printed copies of my memos spread across her desk, along with the Meadowbrook Heights policy file. "I spoke with our legal team this morning," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "They're concerned about the direction Patricia's board is taking. These updated bylaws are problematic from an insurance perspective." "How so?" "Several of these rules exceed the HOA's actual authority under Ohio law. For example, they're trying to regulate things that are explicitly protected by state statute, like solar panels and satellite dishes. If homeowners challenge these rules in court and win, which they probably would, the HOA could be liable for legal fees and damages. Our policy doesn't cover that kind of intentional overreach." I nodded. "So we could deny coverage if someone sues?" "Potentially, yes. And that's a conversation I need to have with Patricia before their renewal comes up." Linda leaned back in her chair. "But here's where it gets complicated for you. Patricia knows you work for our company. She's seen your name on policy documents. If you push back too hard on this Icicles situation, she's going to figure out that you're using your professional knowledge to undermine her authority." "Is that a problem?" "It could be. She could claim you have a conflict of interest. She could demand that we assign their account to a different adjuster. She could even file a complaint against you with the state insurance board, claiming you're using your position inappropriately." I hadn't considered that angle. "So what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting you be smart about this. Document everything, yes. Protect yourself legally, absolutely. But don't make this personal. Don't use your professional knowledge as a weapon against your own HOA board, even if they deserve it." She paused. At least, not obviously. I understood what she was saying. Keep my professional life and my personal life separate, at least on the surface. But that didn't mean I couldn't use what I knew to protect myself and the other homeowners. That afternoon, I did some research into Ohio HOA law. What I found was enlightening. Ohio Revised Code Section 5312 governs homeowner associations in the state, and it's actually pretty protective of homeowner rights. HOAs can create reasonable rules for the community, but those rules have to be applied fairly and consistently. They can't be arbitrary or discriminatory. And importantly, homeowners have the right to challenge fines through a formal hearing process before any penalties are assessed. I went back through the notice Patricia had given me. There was no mention of a hearing process, no information about how to appeal the fine. Just a demand that I comply within 48 hours or face financial penalties. That was a violation of state law right there. I drafted a response letter that evening, keeping my tone professional and factual. I acknowledged receiving the violation notice and requested a formal hearing before the HOA board to contest the fine, as was my right under Ohio law. I noted that icicles were a naturally occurring weather phenomenon, that I had taken reasonable steps to warn pedestrians with a caution sign, and that the icicles would resolve themselves naturally within days as the temperature rose. I also pointed out that numerous other homes in the community currently had similar ice formations, and I requested clarification on why my property had been specifically targeted. I didn't mention my job. I didn't reference insurance liability. I just presented myself as a homeowner exercising his legal rights. The next day was Friday, marking the end of my 48-hour deadline. The weather forecast called for temperatures in the mid-40s over the weekend, which meant the icicles would start melting naturally. But I didn't mention that in my letter. I wanted to see how Patricia would respond to a homeowner who actually knew his rights and was willing to push back. I hand-delivered the letter to Patricia's house that morning before work. She answered the door in workout clothes, clearly on her way out for one of her power walks. "Graham," she said, her voice cold, If you're here to tell me you've removed the icicles, you could have just sent an email. Actually, I'm here to deliver this. I handed her the envelope. It's a formal request for a hearing to contest the violation, as is my right under Ohio law. She took the envelope but didn't open it. There's nothing to contest. You have a hazard on your property. Remove it. The law says I'm entitled to a hearing before any fines are assessed. I'm requesting that hearing. Patricia's face flushed. You're being ridiculous. It's ice. Just knock it down. If it's such a simple matter, then a hearing shouldn't be a problem. The board can explain their reasoning, I can present my case, and we can resolve this properly. Fine, she snapped. The board meets Tuesday evening, 7 o'clock at the community center. You'll get your hearing. Thank you, I'll be there. I turned to leave, but Patricia called after me. Graham, why are you making this so difficult? Other homeowners don't fight us on every little thing. I looked back at her. Maybe they should. Her expression hardened. Be careful. You're not as special as you think you are. I drove to work wondering what she meant by that. It almost sounded like a threat, but I couldn't imagine what Patricia could actually do to me beyond issuing fines that I could easily contest in court. The weekend passed uneventfully. The temperature did rise into the 40s, and about half the icicles melted away. But some of the larger ones remained, and I made a point of photographing them each day to document the natural melting process. On Monday morning, I got an email from Patricia with the subject line, "Board hearing tomorrow evening." The message was brief and formal, confirming the time and location of the hearing, and noting that I would have 15 minutes to present my case. The board's decision would be final and binding unless I chose to pursue the matter through Ohio's dispute resolution process, which would require mediation and potentially court action. I forwarded the email to Linda with a note. FYI, heading into the lion's den tomorrow night. She replied, "Good luck. Remember, professional distance." That evening, I prepared my presentation. I printed out photos of the icicles, including dates and timestamps. I compiled weather data showing the freeze-thaw cycle that had created them. I found examples from other houses in the neighborhood showing similar formations. And most importantly, I printed out relevant sections of Ohio Revised Code Section 5312 regarding homeowner rights and the requirement for fair and consistent rule enforcement. I also did something else. I reached out to some of my neighbors who'd mentioned receiving violation notices. Robert with the basketball hoop, Susan with the garage door incident, Todd who'd been warned about street parking. I invited them to attend the hearing as observers, explaining that this was a public board meeting and they had every right to be there. All three said they'd come. Tuesday evening arrived with surprising speed. I drove to the Meadowbrook Heights Community Center, a small building at the entrance to our subdivision that mostly got used for holiday parties and garage sale coordination. When I arrived at 6:45, Patricia was already there, along with 4 other board members I recognized from the neighborhood. They were seated at a long table at the front of the room, and Patricia was reviewing papers with an intense expression. Robert, Susan, and Todd were sitting in the back row. A few other neighbors I didn't know had also shown up, probably curious about what was happening. Word had apparently spread through the community Facebook group. At precisely 7 o'clock, Patricia called the meeting to order. "We're here tonight to address a violation notice issued to Graham Jackson regarding hazardous icicles on his property," she began, reading from a prepared statement. "Mr. Jackson has requested a formal hearing to contest this notice. He will have 15 minutes to present his case, after which the board will deliberate and issue a decision." She looked up at me. "Mr. Jackson, you may begin." I stood and walked to the front of the room, setting my folder of documents on a small table that had been provided. Thank you for the opportunity to address the board. I want to start by saying that I appreciate everyone's time this evening and the board's service to our community. Always start with courtesy. It's harder for them to be unreasonable if you're polite. On January 14th, I received a violation notice regarding icicles hanging from my gutters. The notice claimed these icicles were a safety hazard and demanded their removal within 48 hours, with a $500 fine for non-compliance. I held up a copy of the notice. I'm here tonight to explain why I believe this notice is unreasonable and why the fine should be dismissed. Patricia started to interrupt, but one of the other board members, a man named Dennis, put a hand on her arm. First, let's look at the icicles in question. I distributed copies of my photos. These were taken on January 14th, the day I received the notice. As you can see, the icicles are approximately 18 to 24 inches in length, hanging from the front gutter of my house. They're positioned about 7 feet above the sidewalk. I moved to the next set of photos. These were taken over the weekend as the temperature warmed. You can see that many of the icicles have naturally melted away, which is exactly what happens with ice formations when the weather changes. The few that remain are significantly smaller. One of the board members, a woman named Janet, spoke up. But they were large last week. That was the hazard we were addressing. I understand that concern, I replied. But consider this. Icicles are a naturally occurring phenomenon in Ohio winters. They form on virtually every building during freeze-thaw cycles. If we're going to classify them as hazards requiring immediate removal, shouldn't that apply to every home in Meadowbrook Heights? I pulled out my next set of photos. These were all taken on the same day I received my violation notice. This is Robert Chen's house, 3 doors down from me, similar icicles. This is the Hendersons' home on Maple Street, larger icicles actually. This is Susan Morty's house. These are Tom and Linda's place. In total, I documented 23 homes with comparable or larger icicle formations, none of which received violation notices. I could see Patricia's face reddening, but I continued. This raises a question of fair and consistent enforcement, which is required under Ohio Revised Code Section 5312.08. I distributed copies of the relevant statute. HOA rules must be applied uniformly to all homeowners. If icicles are truly a hazard requiring fines, why was I the only one cited? Dennis leaned forward. That's a fair point. Patricia shot him a look. We're addressing hazards as we identify them. Just because we haven't gotten to other properties yet doesn't mean Graham gets a pass. Actually, it kind of does, I said. Selective enforcement is legally problematic. But let's move past that for a moment and talk about whether the icicles actually constitute a hazard requiring immediate action. I pulled out my weather documentation. On January 14th, the temperature was 34 degrees and rising. The forecast predicted continued warming through the weekend. Any reasonable person would conclude that the icicles would melt naturally within days, which is exactly what happened. I also placed a caution cone and sign on the sidewalk beneath the icicles to warn pedestrians, demonstrating reasonable care for public safety. Janet nodded slowly. She seemed to be actually listening. Now, here's where this becomes an insurance issue, I said, treading carefully. I wasn't going to reveal my profession, but I could reference insurance generally. The violation notice claimed the icicles posed a liability risk, but by giving me 48 hours to address them, the board acknowledged that the risk wasn't immediate or severe. If someone had been injured during those 48 hours, The HOA would have shared liability for knowing about the hazard and failing to require immediate action. You can't have it both ways. Either it's an emergency requiring instant remediation, or it's a minor issue that can wait. Patricia was glaring at me now. Are you an attorney, Graham? No, but I'm a homeowner who's done his research, which brings me to my final point. I held up the original violation notice. This notice doesn't inform me of my right to a hearing, which is required under Ohio law. It doesn't explain the appeals process. It just threatens financial penalties if I don't comply. That's a violation of Ohio Revised Code Section 5312.07, which requires HOAs to provide homeowners with notice of their rights before assessing fines. The room was completely silent now. Even Patricia seemed momentarily at a loss for words. I'm not trying to be difficult, I said, softening my tone. I understand the board has a job to do, but that job has to be done within legal boundaries and with fair, consistent application of rules. I'm asking the board to dismiss this violation notice and to review your enforcement procedures to ensure they comply with Ohio law. I gathered my papers and returned to my seat. The whole presentation had taken maybe 12 minutes. Patricia stood up, her composure clearly shaken. The board will now deliberate. We'll take a 15-minute recess. The 5 board members filed out of the room into a back office. I could hear raised voices even through the closed door, though I couldn't make out specific words. Robert walked up to me. Man, that was impressive. Where'd you learn all that stuff about HOA law? Google, I said with a shrug, and a strong sense of self-preservation. Susan joined us. I had no idea we could challenge these fines. Patricia made it sound like we just had to pay up. That's what she wants you to think, I replied. But homeowners have rights. You just have to be willing to exercise them. The 15 minutes stretched to 25, then 30. Finally, the board members filed back in. Patricia's face was tight with barely controlled anger, but Dennis looked almost relieved. Patricia remained standing at the table. After reviewing Mr. Jackson's presentation and deliberating as a board, we have reached a decision. She paused, clearly struggling with what she was about to say. The violation notice is dismissed. No fine will be assessed. A small wave of murmurs went through the room. However, Patricia continued, her voice hardening, the board wants to make clear that this decision does not set a precedent for future violations. We take community safety seriously, and we will continue to enforce our rules as we see fit. Mr. Jackson's icicles may have melted naturally, but not every situation will resolve itself so conveniently. Dennis spoke up, which seemed to surprise Patricia. I'd also like to add that the board will be reviewing our violation notice procedures to ensure they comply with Ohio law. Graham raised some valid concerns about how we communicate with homeowners. Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but Janet nodded in agreement. We should probably consult with an attorney about our bylaws too. Make sure everything is legally sound. That's not necessary, Patricia said quickly. We've been operating just fine. Actually, it is necessary, Dennis replied. His voice was mild, but there was steel underneath it. If we're not following state law, we're exposing the entire community to liability. As board members, we have a fiduciary duty to protect the HOA, not expose it to legal risk. I fought to keep the satisfaction off my face. Dennis was right, of course, but hearing a board member actually say it was gratifying. Patricia banged the gavel, clearly eager to end the meeting. Fine. We'll discuss it at our next board meeting. This hearing is adjourned. People started filing out of the community center. Robert clapped me on the shoulder. Nicely done, man. You just took Patricia down a peg. I didn't take her down, I said. I just exercised my rights as a homeowner. But as I walked to my car, I noticed Patricia watching me from the doorway of the community center. The look on her face suggested this wasn't over, not by a long shot. I got my confirmation of that the next morning when I received an email from the HOA board. It was sent to all residents of Meadowbrook Heights and was clearly Patricia's response to what had happened at the hearing. "Dear residents," it began. "The board wants to remind everyone that Meadowbrook Heights has rules and regulations designed to maintain property values and ensure community safety. While we respect homeowners' rights, we also expect cooperation and compliance with reasonable board decisions. Recent challenges to board authority have created unnecessary conflict and wasted valuable volunteer time. We ask that all residents approach violations in a spirit of cooperation rather than confrontation. The board is here to serve the community, not to engage in legal battles with individual homeowners." The email went on for several paragraphs in a similar vein, never mentioning me by name but clearly aimed at my actions. The message was obvious: don't challenge us or you'll be painted as a troublemaker. Several people replied on the community Facebook group, and the responses were mixed. Some thanked me for standing up to the board. Others said I was being difficult, and that HOAs couldn't function if everyone questioned every rule. A few pointed out that Patricia's email itself seemed confrontational, which was ironic given her call for cooperation. I didn't engage with any of it. I'd made my point at the hearing, and the violation had been dismissed. Getting into social media arguments would just make me look petty. But 2 days later, I got another violation notice. This one claimed that my garbage cans were visible from the street, which violated the updated bylaws requiring all trash receptacles to be stored out of sight, except during pickup hours. The fine was $150, with a 1-week deadline for compliance. I looked out at my garbage cans. They were in the same place they'd been for 3 years, tucked against the side of my garage but technically visible from certain angles. I walked around the neighborhood that evening and counted at least 15 other houses with similarly visible garbage cans, including Patricia's own house. This was retaliation, pure and simple. I took photos documenting all the visible garbage cans, including timestamps and addresses. Then I filed another request for a hearing, citing the same selective enforcement issues I'd raised about the Icicles. Patricia's response came via email this time. "Your hearing is scheduled for February 10th at 7 p.m. The board hopes you'll reconsider wasting everyone's time over minor violations that could be easily corrected with simple cooperation." The tone was openly hostile now. Patricia wasn't even trying to hide her animosity. I forwarded the email to Linda at work. "FYI, round 2 incoming." She called me 5 minutes later. "Graham, this is getting out of hand. She's clearly targeting you, I know. Are you sure you want to keep fighting this? You could just move your garbage cans and be done with it." "I could," I admitted. "But then what's the next thing?" "Patricia's not going to stop until someone stops her, and I'm in a position to do that," Linda sighed. "Just be careful, and for God's sake, keep documenting everything." Over the next week, I watched Patricia's pattern become clearer. She wasn't just targeting me. She was systematically working through homeowners who'd shown any support for my position. Robert got a notice about his basketball hoop. Susan got another notice about leaving her garage door open. Todd got an actual fine for the overnight parking violation, even though several other people regularly parked on the street with no consequences. The community Facebook group was turning into a war zone, with some residents defending Patricia and others complaining about harassment. The board's credibility was crumbling, and Patricia's response was to double down on enforcement. Then something interesting happened. Dennis, the board member who'd spoken up during my hearing, resigned. He posted a message to the Facebook group explaining that he couldn't, in good conscience, continue serving on a board that was ignoring legal requirements and selectively enforcing rules. His post was carefully worded, never directly criticizing Patricia, but the implication was clear. That left 4 board members, with Patricia firmly in control of the remaining 3. The garbage can hearing followed the same pattern as the Icicles hearing. I presented my evidence of selective enforcement. I cited Ohio law. I was professional and courteous. And the board dismissed the violation, though Patricia made it clear they were only doing so because of the selective enforcement issue, not because they agreed with me. We'll be conducting a community-wide review of garbage can placement, she announced at the end of the hearing. Everyone will be required to move their cans out of sight within 30 days. No exceptions, which was fine, actually. If the rule was applied to everyone equally, I had no problem following it, but 3 days later, I got another violation notice. This one claimed my mailbox was the wrong color and needed to be repainted to match the approved color scheme outlined in the community guidelines. Fine. $100. I looked at my mailbox. It was black, the same color it had been when I bought the house. I pulled up the original community guidelines from 2019, before Patricia's board rewrote everything. Black was listed as an approved color, but in the updated 2025 guidelines, there was a new section specifying that mailboxes must be brown, cream, or forest green to maintain aesthetic cohesion. This was getting ridiculous. Patricia was combing through the updated bylaws looking for things to cite me for, regardless of whether the rules made any sense. I did something different this time. Instead of requesting another hearing, I contacted a real estate attorney in Columbus named Michael Brennan. I'd met him once at a professional conference and remembered that he specialized in HOA disputes. Michael listened to my story, reviewed the documentation I'd compiled, and let out a low whistle. This is one of the clearer cases of selective enforcement and harassment I've seen. You could absolutely sue them. I don't want to sue them, I said. I just want them to stop. Sometimes the threat of a lawsuit is enough. Let me send them a letter outlining the legal issues and requesting that they cease all enforcement actions against you pending a comprehensive review of their bylaws. That might back them off. How much will that cost me? Call it $500 for the letter and initial consultation. If they ignore it and we have to escalate, we'll talk about next steps. I authorized him to proceed. Michael drafted a detailed letter highlighting the selective enforcement, the retaliatory nature of the recent violations, and the questionable legality of several rules in the updated bylaws. He sent it to Patricia and the entire board via certified mail. Patricia's response was explosive. She sent an email to all Meadowbrook Heights residents with the subject line, "Legal threats against your HOA board." The message painted me as a litigious troublemaker who was trying to intimidate volunteer board members with expensive legal action. She claimed I was costing the community money that could be spent on improvements and maintenance. She even suggested that my behavior might lead to increased HOA fees to cover legal costs. The community reaction was swift and divided. Some people were angry at me for attacking the board. Others pointed out that Patricia was the one creating the legal exposure by ignoring Ohio law. The Facebook group descended into accusations and name-calling. And then Linda called me with news that changed everything. "Graham, I need you to sit down for this. Patricia filed a formal complaint against you with the state insurance board." I felt my stomach drop. "On what grounds?" She claims you're using your position as an insurance adjuster to harass and intimidate your HOA board. She says you threatened to interfere with their coverage renewal if they didn't dismiss your violations. She's claiming professional misconduct and abuse of your position. That's completely false. I never mentioned their insurance. I never threatened anything related to my job. I know that. But she's smart enough to make it plausible. She submitted copies of your violation notices and the attorney letter as evidence that you're engaging in a pattern of behavior designed to undermine board authority. And here's the kicker. She's demanding that we assign their account to a different adjuster, claiming that you have a conflict of interest. This was worse than I'd anticipated. A complaint to the state board could affect my professional license. Even if it was ultimately dismissed, the investigation process would be a nightmare. What do I do? First, don't panic. These complaints get filed all the time and most of them go nowhere. Second, document every single interaction you've had with the HOA board. Prove that you never used your professional position inappropriately. Third, let me handle the reassignment request. I'll assign their account to Derek, which removes any appearance of conflict. That feels like giving in to her. It's protecting yourself professionally. Graham, I'm serious about this. You can fight Patricia on HOA issues all day long, but you cannot risk your career over garbage cans and icicles. She was right, of course. I spent that evening writing out a detailed timeline of every interaction with Patricia, every violation notice, every hearing, every email. I documented that I had never mentioned my job or Meadowbrook Heights insurance policy in any of my challenges to the board. I gathered evidence showing that my legal pushback was based on publicly available Ohio law, not insider insurance knowledge. Michael Brennan helped me prepare a response to the state board complaint, and we submitted it within the required time frame. Then, I waited. Waiting turned out to be its own kind of torture. The state board investigation could take weeks or even months. In the meantime, Patricia knew she'd landed a blow, and she pressed her advantage. I received 3 more violation notices over the next 2 weeks. My lawn furniture was the wrong style. A crack in my driveway needed immediate repair. My house number wasn't clearly visible from the street, despite being in the exact same place it had been for 3 years. I filed hearing requests for all of them, and all of them were dismissed due to selective enforcement. But Patricia was succeeding in making my life miserable, which was clearly the point. She wanted me to give up and move away. Then something unexpected happened. A reporter from the Columbus Dispatch called me. "Mr. Jackson, I'm doing a story on HOA overreach in suburban Columbus communities. Your name came up in connection with Meadowbrook Heights. Would you be willing to talk to me?" I was cautious. "How did you get my name?" "One of your neighbors reached out to me, Robert Chen. He said your situation was a perfect example of what happens when HOA boards operate without accountability." I thought about it. Talking to the press could escalate things dramatically. But it could also shine a public light on Patricia's behavior, which might be the only thing that would actually change it. "I'll talk to you," I said. "But I want to be clear that I'm not trying to destroy the HOA. I'm trying to make it follow the law." The reporter, a woman named Jennifer Kowalski, came to my house the next day. She interviewed me for over an hour, going through my documentation and asking detailed questions about each violation notice. She also spoke with Robert, Susan, and several other homeowners who'd had similar experiences. The article ran 3 days later under the headline, "When HOAs Go Too Far, Columbus Homeowners Fight Back Against Selective Enforcement." It was fair and balanced, including quotes from Patricia defending the board's actions. but it also highlighted the questionable legality of several rules and the pattern of selective enforcement that multiple homeowners had experienced. The reaction was immediate. The article was shared hundreds of times on social media. Local news stations picked up the story. Suddenly, Meadowbrook Heights HOA was in the spotlight, and not in a good way. Patricia sent out an emergency email calling for a special board meeting to address false media narratives about our community. But by then, it was too late to control the narrative. Other HOA reform advocates in Ohio had picked up the story, using it as an example of why the state needed stronger oversight of homeowner associations. And then the lawsuit came, not against me, against the HOA board. Susan Morty, the neighbor who'd been repeatedly fined for her garage door, filed a civil suit alleging harassment, selective enforcement, and violation of her rights under Ohio HOA law. Her attorney was Michael Brennan, the same one I'd consulted with. Michael called me after filing the suit. "Graham, I want to be transparent with you. Susan's case is stronger than yours because she can document actual financial harm from the fines she paid before she knew she could fight them. But your documentation is going to be critical to proving the pattern of selective enforcement. Are you willing to be a witness?" "Absolutely." The lawsuit changed the dynamic completely. Suddenly, Patricia and her board were on the defensive, and their insurance company was very interested in what was happening. Linda called me with an update. "Derek's been fielding calls from Patricia about Susan's lawsuit. She wants to know if we'll cover their legal defense." "Will you?" "That depends. If the board was acting within their authority and following proper procedures, yes. If they were engaging in harassment or violating state law, no. Derek's conducting a thorough review of their actions over the past 6 months." I knew what he was going to find. Patricia's pattern of selective enforcement was documented in multiple violation notices, hearing records, and witness statements. The updated bylaws contained rules that conflicted with Ohio law, and the board's failure to provide proper notice of homeowner rights violated state requirements. 2 weeks later, Midwest Community Management sent a letter to Meadowbrook Heights HOA. The letter, which Patricia was required to share with all homeowners per the bylaws, informed the board that their liability coverage would not be renewed when it expired in March. The reason cited was substantial compliance concerns and potential for ongoing legal liability that exceeds acceptable risk parameters. In plain English, Patricia's board had made the HOA uninsurable. The community Facebook group exploded. Homeowners who'd been defending Patricia suddenly realized what this meant. Without liability insurance, the HOA couldn't legally operate in Ohio. Every board member would be personally liable for any lawsuit or injury claim. The community would have to either find new insurance at a likely astronomical cost or dissolve the HOA entirely. An emergency homeowners meeting was called. Over 90 of the 120 households showed up, cramming into the community center. Patricia tried to maintain control of the meeting, but she was shouted down by angry homeowners demanding answers. Dennis, the former board member who'd resigned, stood up and addressed the crowd. "I warned the board months ago that we were heading in this direction. When you ignore state law and target homeowners selectively, you create legal liability. Insurance companies aren't stupid. They can see what's happening, and they won't cover negligence and misconduct." Patricia tried to defend her actions, but her voice was shaking. "We were just trying to maintain standards, to protect property values. By violating people's legal rights," Susan called out. "I've paid over $800 in fines for things like having my garage door open. Other people do the same things and never get notices. That's not protecting property values. That's harassment. The meeting devolved into chaos, with multiple people demanding Patricia's resignation. She refused, insisting that the board had done nothing wrong and that it was troublemakers like me who had caused the insurance problem. But 2 days later, all 4 remaining board members resigned. They issued a joint statement saying they could no longer serve in the current environment and that the homeowners needed to elect new leadership. That left Meadowbrook Heights without a functioning board, without insurance, and with a lawsuit pending. A group of concerned homeowners, including Dennis, Robert, and a few others, organized an interim committee to stabilize the situation. Their first action was to hire a real estate attorney to review the bylaws and bring them into compliance with Ohio law. Their second action was to reach out to insurance companies about obtaining new coverage. I attended the interim committee meetings as an observer. I didn't volunteer for leadership because I thought it would be seen as a power grab, but I offered to help with the insurance situation. I can reach out to other carriers, I told Dennis. I know the market. I can tell you what they'll want to see before they'll issue a policy. Dennis accepted gratefully. That would be incredibly helpful. Over the next few weeks, I worked with the interim committee to prepare a comprehensive package for insurance carriers. We documented the board resignations, the ongoing bylaw review, and the steps being taken to ensure compliance with Ohio law. We included letters from multiple homeowners attesting to the changes being implemented. Michael Brennan also helped, negotiating with Susan to put her lawsuit on hold pending the completion of the bylaw review. Susan agreed, saying she just wanted fair treatment, not to destroy the community. Finally, in mid-March, I was able to secure a new liability policy through a different carrier. The premium was higher than what Midwest Community Management had charged, but it was manageable. The new carrier made it clear that coverage was conditional on the HOA maintaining proper procedures and following Ohio law. Elections for a new board were held in April. Dennis was elected president. Janet, the board member who'd shown some reasonableness during my hearings, was elected vice president. 3 new members joined them, including Robert. One of their first actions was to formally apologize to the homeowners who'd been targeted by Patricia's enforcement campaign. They refunded all fines that had been paid under the previous board's questionable rules. They adopted new procedures requiring legal review before any rule changes and ensuring that violation notices included information about homeowner rights. Susan dropped her lawsuit. The state insurance board dismissed Patricia's complaint against me after finding no evidence that I'd used my professional position inappropriately. The investigator's report noted that I had exercised my legal rights as a homeowner and that my challenges to the board were based on publicly available Ohio law, not insider insurance knowledge. Life in Meadowbrook Heights gradually returned to normal, though it was a different kind of normal than before. People paid more attention to board meetings. Homeowners asked more questions about rule enforcement. There was a sense that we'd all learned something about the importance of accountability. As for Patricia, she moved out of the community in June. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd taken a job in another state. I never spoke to her again after the final community meeting where the board resigned. One evening in July, I was sitting on my front porch when Robert walked over with a couple of beers. He handed me one and settled into the chair next to mine. "You know, I've been thinking about everything that happened," he said. "If you hadn't pushed back on that icicle violation, Patricia would still be running things her way. A lot of us would still be getting harassed." I took a sip of beer. I didn't do it to be a hero. I just didn't want to pay $500 for ice. Robert laughed. Still, you started something. You showed the rest of us that we didn't have to just take it. It was a team effort. Dennis quitting the board, you standing up at meetings, Susan filing her lawsuit. One person can't change a system alone. Maybe not, but someone has to be willing to be first. He raised his beer. Thanks for being first. We clinked bottles and sat in comfortable silence, watching the summer sun set over the neighborhood. My gutters were icicle-free. My garbage cans were properly stored, and my mailbox was still black because the new board had removed the arbitrary color restrictions from the bylaws. In the end, the whole situation had taught me something important. Systems only work when people hold them accountable. HOA boards can serve a legitimate purpose in maintaining communities, but they need oversight and boundaries. When boards exceed their authority, it's not just the targeted homeowners who suffer. The entire community bears the cost in legal fees, insurance problems, and destroyed trust. I'd been in a unique position to understand the insurance implications of Patricia's overreach, but I'd also been lucky. Lucky to have neighbors willing to stand with me. Lucky to have a boss who supported me professionally while keeping appropriate boundaries. Lucky that Ohio law protects homeowner rights. Not everyone in an HOA dispute is that fortunate. I thought about the people living in communities where boards operated unchecked, where homeowners didn't know their rights or couldn't afford attorneys. The situation at Meadowbrook Heights could have ended very differently if circumstances had been slightly altered. As summer turned to fall, the new board continued making improvements. They organized actual community events instead of just enforcement actions. They solicited input from homeowners before making decisions. They published transparent financial reports showing where HOA fees were being spent. Property values in Meadowbrook Heights actually increased, despite Patricia's dire warnings that challenging the board would hurt everyone's investments. Turns out people liked living in a community where the HOA was reasonable and accountable. I ran into Dennis at the grocery store in October. He was pushing a cart full of supplies for the community Halloween party. "How's the board president job treating you?" I asked. He groaned good-naturedly. "It's more work than I expected, but it's also more rewarding. We're actually helping people instead of fighting with them." "Any regrets about getting involved?" "Not one." He paused. "You know, we're looking for volunteers for the Architectural Review Committee. Any interest?" I laughed. "After everything I went through with the last board." "You think I want to be the person telling people what color their mailboxes can be? We've streamlined that whole process. Basic guidelines, reasonable standards, no arbitrary enforcement. And having someone who understands insurance liability would be valuable when we're reviewing major renovation requests." I considered it. The idea of helping ensure the community didn't slide back into Patricia-style overreach was appealing, and I did have relevant expertise to offer. "Let me think about it," I said. Dennis nodded. "Fair enough. The offer's open whenever you're ready." That winter, the first major snowstorm hit Columbus in early December. I woke up to find beautiful icicles forming along my gutters just like the previous year. I grabbed my coffee and stood on the front porch, admiring them in the morning light. My phone buzzed with a text from Robert. "Icicle Watch 2026. Should we alert the HOA?" He'd included a laughing emoji. I texted back. "Let them melt naturally. I heard that's allowed now." The doorbell rang a few minutes later. I opened it to find Dennis standing there with a clipboard, his face serious. My heart sank for just a moment before I saw him break into a grin. "Sir, I'm here about a safety violation," he said in an exaggerated official voice. Those icicles are gorgeous, and I'm going to need you to leave them up so everyone can enjoy them. I laughed. You're terrible. Had to do it. The joke was too perfect. He lowered the clipboard, which I could now see was blank. Seriously, though, enjoy your winter decorations. Natural or otherwise. After Dennis left, I went back inside and pulled up my computer. I'd been thinking about Robert's comment that I'd been first to push back against Patricia's overreach. Maybe there was something more I could do with that experience. I started writing. Not just documenting what had happened to me, but creating a guide for other homeowners facing similar situations. I outlined Ohio HOA law in plain English. I explained how to request hearings, how to document selective enforcement, when to consult attorneys, and how to organize community action. Over the next few months, I expanded it into a comprehensive resource. I shared it with Michael Brennan for legal review, and he helped refine the language. Then I created a website and posted it publicly, along with my story about the icicles and everything that followed. The response was overwhelming. I started getting emails from homeowners across Ohio and then from other states, sharing their own HOA nightmare stories. Many had successfully challenged their boards using the strategies I'd outlined. Others were just beginning their fights and wanted advice. I found myself becoming an accidental advocate for HOA reform. I gave interviews to local news stations, testified before state legislative committees considering new HOA oversight laws, and connected homeowners with attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes. In March, exactly 1 year after Midwest Community Management had declined to renew Meadowbrook Heights insurance, I accepted Dennis's invitation to join the Architectural Review Committee. It seemed like the right way to close the circle, using my experience to help prevent future problems rather than just reacting to them. At my first committee meeting, we reviewed a request from a homeowner who wanted to install solar panels. Under Patricia's board, this would have been denied or subjected to arbitrary restrictions. Under the new bylaws, we verified that the installation met Ohio's solar access laws, checked that it wouldn't create genuine safety issues, and approved it within 2 weeks. See, Dennis said after the meeting, "You're already making this easier. You knew exactly which insurance questions to ask about the installation." He was right. My professional knowledge was finally being used to help the community rather than to defend myself against it. That spring, Susan Morty approached me at a community yard sale. We hadn't spoken much since her lawsuit was dropped, and I wasn't sure how she felt about everything that had happened. "Graham, I wanted to thank you," she said. "I know settling my lawsuit meant I didn't get any money, but honestly, getting the board to change was worth more than any settlement." "You were brave to file it in the first place," I replied. "That took guts. So did fighting over icicles." She smiled. "Everyone thought you were crazy at first. Turns out you were just ahead of the curve." "I was stubborn. There's a difference. Call it what you want, but you started something important." As I drove home from the yard sale that afternoon, I thought about how much had changed in 18 months. It had started with something as simple and silly as ice hanging from my gutters. Patricia had seen it as an opportunity to assert her authority. I'd seen it as an unreasonable overreach. Neither of us could have predicted where that conflict would lead. The fight had cost me time, stress, and money for attorneys. It had nearly cost me my professional reputation. But it had also revealed something crucial about how power works in small communities. When people with authority stop being accountable, they don't usually recognize their own overreach. They genuinely believe they're acting in the community's best interest, even as they trample on people's rights. Patricia probably still thought she'd been in the right. In her mind, she'd been trying to maintain standards and protect property values. The fact that she'd violated state law, selectively enforced arbitrary rules, and created massive insurance liability for the community didn't factor into her self-image as a dedicated volunteer. That was the insidious thing about unchecked HOA power. The people wielding it rarely saw themselves as bullies or tyrants. They saw themselves as protectors of the community, defenders of property values, guardians of neighborhood character. And that self-righteousness made them dangerous because they felt justified in their overreach. But systems could change. Meadowbrook Heights had changed. We had a functioning board now that respected homeowner rights and followed the law. We had bylaws that made sense and were applied consistently. We had a community that paid attention and held leadership accountable. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements and complaints. Some people thought the new board was too lenient. Others thought they were still too strict. But the difference was that now there was a process for addressing those concerns, a process that respected everyone's rights and followed established law. In December of that second year, the Icicles returned. This time, half the neighborhood had them. I took photos of mine and posted them to the community Facebook group with the caption, "Winter's back. Stay warm, everyone." Patricia was long gone, but her legacy lingered in the reformed bylaws, the more engaged homeowners, and the cautionary tale that was still sometimes shared at board meetings. The Icicles had become a sort of community inside joke, a reminder of how something small and natural had exposed something much larger and more important. As I stood on my porch that evening, watching the winter sun make the icicles sparkle like chandeliers, I felt something close to contentment. The fight had been worth it, not just for me, but for everyone in Meadowbrook Heights who now lived in a community where the HOA served the homeowners rather than controlling them. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Linda at work. "Saw your icicles on Facebook. Don't get any ideas about making them a hazard again. I'm running out of patience with your neighborhood drama." She'd added a winking emoji. I texted back, "These icicles are perfectly safe. I'm an insurance professional. I would know." The irony wasn't lost on me. My job, which Patricia had tried to use as a weapon against me, had ultimately been the key to understanding how to fight back effectively. My knowledge of insurance liability had shown me exactly where her overreach was creating problems, not just for individual homeowners but for the entire community. That knowledge had been powerful, but it hadn't been enough by itself. Real change had required community action, legal support, media attention, and sustained effort from multiple people over many months. One person understanding insurance law couldn't transform an out-of-control HOA. But one person willing to stand up and document the problems could start a process that led to transformation. As winter deepened and the icicles grew longer, I sometimes wondered what had happened to Patricia. Was she running another HOA somewhere, recreating the same patterns? Had she learned anything from the Meadowbrook Heights experience? Or did she still believe she'd been the victim of unreasonable homeowners who didn't appreciate her volunteer service? I'd probably never know. But I hoped, for the sake of wherever she'd ended up, that she'd gained some perspective. Power without accountability corrupts, even in organizations as mundane as homeowner associations. Maybe especially in organizations that mundane, where the stakes seem low and the oversight is minimal. The story of the icicles and the insurance adjuster became something I shared often in the years that followed. It became a teaching example in the homeowner advocacy work I continued doing. It illustrated how ordinary people could push back against unreasonable authority using knowledge, documentation, and persistence. Some people heard the story and focused on the conflict. They saw it as me being difficult or Patricia being tyrannical. But the real lesson was simpler. Systems work best when everyone understands the rules and those rules are applied fairly. When that breaks down, someone has to be willing to challenge the breakdown, even over something as seemingly trivial as icicles hanging from a gutter. Years later, I'm still living in Meadowbrook Heights. The community has continued to evolve and improve. Property values have risen. Families have moved in and out. The board has turned over multiple times, always with Dennis's reformed bylaws serving as a foundation for reasonable governance. And every winter, when the icicles form on houses throughout the neighborhood, I think about that morning when Patricia showed up with her clipboard and her righteous indignation. I think about how close I came to just knocking them down and moving on with my life. I think about what would have happened if I had, how Patricia's board would have continued unchecked, how many more homeowners would have been harassed and fined for arbitrary violations. The icicles still form every year, beautiful and temporary, naturally occurring works of frozen art. They're not hazards. They're not violations. They're just ice, doing what ice does in Ohio winters. And now in Meadowbrook Heights at least, that's perfectly fine.